Are you really gonna leave me here, Jin-Hee?
A discharge form signed at 3:15 a.m. on a storm-drenched Tuesday should have closed the file on Tae Chihun forever. 4 hours of monitoring vitals, adjusting 4 lines, and pretending not to notice the fresh surgical dressings soaking through his shirt. That was supposed to be in Jin-Hee's entire connection to the man in the isolated VIP ward. The rain hammered the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Seoul, and somewhere below, the city glittered like it hadn't just watched a man nearly bleed out in a Gangnam ambush. But when Jin-Hee stepped back into room 701 to log her final notes, she found him already sitting up, spine straight, dark eyes fixed on her with a calm that felt more dangerous than any threat. His unbuttoned shirt exposed the bandages wrapped tight across his ribs. In his hand, held out toward her like it weighed nothing, was a black card with no visible limit. "Don't let me die tonight," he said. "I'll pay any price." Jin-Hee wasn't naive. She'd heard the whispers about the Golden Dragon Syndicate long before tonight. The empire that moved through Seoul's ports and back alleys without ever showing its face in daylight. She also knew her family's debt collectors were done waiting. Her brother had come home shaking 2 days ago, and she still hadn't told him why. A blank check from a man who ran the dark side of the city wasn't a gift. It was a door, and doors like that only open one way. If a man who commands the underworld hands you an unlimited card to keep him alive, do you take it and risk losing everything you are, or do you walk away and let the debt collectors take your family instead? Tell me right now in the comments. Take it or walk away. This is the story of a nurse who thought she was working one impossible night and never left his side again. If you're watching this from wherever you are tonight, welcome. This is a place for people who love a slow burn, a dangerous man, and a woman strong enough to hold her ground against him. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and stay close, because where Jin-Hee is about to go, you don't want to miss a single step. Like this if you're already picking a side. I'll see you inside. The card sat cold and impossibly light in Jin-Hee's palm, and for 3 full seconds she couldn't make herself close her fingers around it. Outside the door, heavy boots shifted against tile. 2 men, maybe 3, their silhouettes broken and reassembled by the frosted glass panel like something out of a nightmare she hadn't agreed to have. She could still walk away. She could set the card on the rolling tray, log her shift, and pretend the last 10 minutes of her life hadn't happened. Then she thought of Mingyu's face that afternoon. He'd come home from school 2 hours early, backpack still slung over one shoulder, and stood frozen in the doorway of their cramped apartment while a man in a gray tracksuit leaned against the stairwell railing outside, smiling at nothing. "Tell your sister the grace period's over," the man had said, loud enough for the whole floor to hear. "Tell her interest doesn't wait for a nursing salary." Mingyu hadn't said a word about it until Jin-Hee noticed his hands shaking around his chopsticks at dinner, and even then he'd only whispered it, like saying it louder might make it more real. She closed her fingers around the black card. "You understand what you're accepting," Chihun said. It wasn't a question. He was watching her the way a man watches weather, assessing, calculating, already 3 moves ahead of whatever she might do next. Blood had seeped through the fresh gauze at his side, a dark bloom spreading slow and steady against white cotton, and his jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscle working beneath his skin. He was in pain. He was hiding it well, but he was in pain, and somewhere underneath the arrogance in his eyes, there was a flicker of something rawer, a man doing math on how many hours he had left. "Understand that if I don't finish reviewing your chart in the next few minutes, you could throw a clot and die before your own men get through that door," Jin-Hee said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "That's what I understand." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but close to one, filed away for later. "Lock it," he said, nodding toward the door. She didn't ask why. She crossed the room, turned the deadbolt hospital protocol expressly forbade her from touching, and became, in that single click of metal, a woman who no longer worked inside the rules she'd spent 6 years building her whole identity around. The next 4 hours belonged entirely to his body. She stripped away the temporary dressing his surgeon had left and found the wound worse than the chart suggested, a through-and-through that had nicked the edge of his liver, sloppily closed by a trauma team more concerned with speed than precision. She irrigated it properly this time, her hands moving with the quiet, absolute confidence that had made her the nurse every surgeon on her floor requested by name. She recalculated his anticoagulant dosage from scratch, cross-referencing his weight, his blood pressure, the faint tremor she'd caught in his left hand that told her his surgeon had likely underestimated his risk of a post-operative stroke. She adjusted his foredrip twice, watched his oxygen saturation climb back into a range that didn't make her chest tight with dread, and around 2 a.m., when a fresh wave of pain hit him hard enough to whiten his knuckles against the sheets, she found herself sitting on the edge of his bed without having decided to, her hand pressed flat against his sternum, murmuring instructions to breathe through it the way she'd once talked her own mother through her final year of chemotherapy. He didn't flinch away from her touch. He watched her face instead, like he was trying to memorize the particular kind of person who stayed when staying cost her something. Most people run from men like me, he said quietly, somewhere around 3 a.m., his voice roughened by exhaustion. Even the ones I pay well. I'm not running because you're paying me, Jin-Hee said, checking his pulse against her watch. I'm not running because if I walk out that door, you die, and then I've wasted 4 hours I could have spent sleeping. He laughed, a short, surprised sound, immediately swallowed by a wince. Careful, nurse. I might start liking you. Don't, she said. It'll make this easier for both of us. By the time gray light started bleeding through the storm clouds over the skyline, his vitals had stabilized into something that no longer terrified her, and Jin-Hee allowed herself, for the first time since midnight, to sit back in the chair beside his bed and simply breathe. The black card was still in her scrub pocket, a small square weight she hadn't let herself think about yet. She watched the sun climb reluctantly over Seoul's glass towers, painting the wet streets amber, and felt the particular hollow ache of a person who has just crossed a line she can't uncross. Chihun was asleep, or close to it, his breathing finally even. She let herself study him for exactly 10 seconds, the sharp line of his jaw, the way even unconscious he held himself like a man who'd never once in his life felt safe enough to fully let go, before she caught herself doing it and looked away, irritated at her own weakness. She didn't get the chance to log her shift. At 6:40 a.m., the door opened without a knock. A man in a charcoal suit stepped through first, and everything about him telegraphed control. The precise part in his hair, the flat, assessing sweep of his eyes across the room. The way 3 other men in near-identical suits arranged themselves behind him like pieces already placed on a board. His gaze landed on Jin-Hee and did not warm. "Boss," he said, not looking away from her. "The hospital's compromised." Security footage from the east stairwell went dark for 90 seconds around 4 a.m. "We're moving you now." Chihun's eyes opened, alert instantly, all traces of the man who'd laughed at her joke an hour ago gone, replaced by something colder and infinitely more careful. "Tongyeon," he said, "you're late." "Traffic," Ki Tongyeon said dryly, though his eyes hadn't left Jin. "Who's this?" "The nurse who kept me breathing tonight while your security failed," Chihun said, swinging his legs off the bed with a controlled grimace that told Jin-Hee exactly how much that motion cost him. "In Jin-Hee, she comes with us." Jin-Hee stood so fast her chair scraped against tile. "I have a shift to log. A hospital that expects me back on Thursday. A brother who's going to panic if I don't come home. Your shift ended the moment you locked that door," Chihun said, not unkindly, but with the flat finality of a man who had never once had to repeat himself in his life. "You're not hospital staff anymore, Ms. In. You're mine. I don't share my medical care with an institution that let an assassin walk my floor unnoticed. Tongyeon will handle the details. I didn't agree to." "You took the card." His eyes found hers, steady, almost gentle, which somehow frightened her more than any threat could have. "That was the agreement. Don't let me die. I pay any price." "This is the price, Jin-Hee. You get to keep breathing, and so does your brother." The mention of Mingyu landed like a hand closing around her throat. She understood, in that moment, precisely how thoroughly Chihun's people had already gone through her life. Her debts, her family, the exact pressure point that would make her stay without a fight. It should have terrified her more than it did. Instead, Underneath the fear, she felt something colder and more practical settle into place. If she was already in this deep, she might as well make sure she survived it. "My brother comes too," she said. "Wherever this is, he doesn't leave my sight." Something flickered across Chihun's face. Approval, maybe, or the particular respect one predator affords another that refuses to bare its throat. "Tangyeon, get the boy." They moved fast after that, the way people who did this often moved. A black SUV convoy waiting at a service entrance. Jeannie's protest folded neatly under the sheer efficiency of men who'd clearly done this before. Mingyu was collected from his school with a story about a family emergency that made his face go pale with worry until he saw Jin-Hee waiting in the car. And then his relief was so plain, so young, that she had to look out the window to keep her composure. The Hanamdong penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a tower Jin-Hee had walked past 100 times without ever imagining she'd see the inside of it. The elevator required a fingerprint and a retinal scan. The living room alone was larger than her entire apartment, all white stone and floor-to-ceiling glass. The city spread out below like something offered rather than simply viewed. Mingyu's mouth actually fell open when he stepped inside, and for one unguarded moment, he looked exactly like what he was, a 16-year-old boy who'd spent the last 6 months watching his sister count coins for the subway. "There's a room for you at the end of the East Hall," Tangyeon told him, his tone noticeably warmer than the one he'd used with Jin-Hee. "PlayStation's already set up. Don't touch anything in the boss's study." Mingyu looked at Jin-Hee with wide, silent questions, and she managed a smile she didn't fully feel. "Go look at your room," she said. "I need to talk to someone first." She found Chihun in what she assumed was his private quarters, a bedroom that could have belonged to a hotel's presidential suite, sparse and controlled. Nothing personal visible anywhere except a single framed photograph turned face down on the dresser that she made a mental note to ask about later. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, shirt off now, a fresh set of bandages already applied by someone with considerably less skill than she had, judging by the slightly crooked tape. "You have a private medical team," she said without preamble, arms crossed. "You have to. A man in your position doesn't survive this long without doctors on retainer, specialists, a full surgical suite somewhere in this building for all I know. So explain to me why I'm standing here instead of them." Chihun studied her for a long moment before answering, and when he did, his voice had lost the commanding edge from the hospital, replaced by something quieter, more tired. "I had 6 doctors on retainer before tonight. Every one of them has a price. Peon Yongji's people found 4 of those prices in the last 18 months alone." He watched the information land on her face. A bought doctor tells you what someone else paid him to say. A bribed nurse betrays you slowly, professionally, with plausible deniability. But a desperate one. His eyes moved over her, not unkindly, more like an assessment finally completing itself. A desperate one has a brother in the East Wing right now eating room service he's never had before. A desperate one has debt collectors who'll be very interested to hear the hospital thinks she abandoned her post overnight. "You don't have the luxury of betraying me, Jin-Hee. You only have the luxury of keeping me alive." "That's not loyalty," she said. "That's leverage." "In my world," Chihun said, "they're the same thing." He leaned back slightly, and pain flickered across his face before he mastered it. "I don't need you to like me. I need you to keep my heart beating and my organs functioning. And in exchange, your brother sleeps somewhere the loan sharks can't reach him. That's the entire contract. Simple. Clean." Nothing about it felt clean to Jin-Hee, but she recognized, with the particular clarity that came from watching her mother die slowly of a disease neither of them could afford to treat properly, that some transactions weren't about fairness. They were about survival. She'd survive this. She'd keep them both alive, Chihun, because it was apparently now her entire existence, and Mingyu, because he was the only reason any of it mattered. "Fine," she said, "but I run your medical care my way. No more crooked bandages. No more guessing at your dosages. And you tell me the truth about your condition, all of it, or I can't do my job." Something almost like respect crossed his face. "Deal." The second night at the penthouse, Jin-Hee was asleep for less than 3 hours before the alarm tore her out of it. It wasn't a sound she recognized at first. A sharp, insistent chime coming from the tablet Tongyeon had left in her room, synced to Chihun's biometric monitors. Heart rate spiking. Oxygen dropping. She was out of bed and moving down the hallway before she'd fully processed what she was seeing, her bare feet silent against marble, adrenaline burning through the last fog of sleep. She found him on the floor beside his bed, body rigid, back arched, every muscle locked in a violent seizure that had knocked the nightstand lamp to the ground beside him. His skin was clammy and gray under the low light, his eyes open but unseeing, fixed on some point in the middle distance that clearly wasn't the ceiling of his bedroom. No, no. Get it off. Get it off me. His voice was raw, cracked, nothing like the control command she'd heard from him all day. His hands clawed uselessly at his own throat. Chihun, look at me. Jin-Hee dropped to her knees beside him, checking his airway was clear, monitoring the terrifying rhythm of his pulse under her fingers. It was too fast, wildly irregular, his whole body caught in some feedback loop of terror that had nothing to do with the wound in his side. This wasn't a normal seizure. She'd seen dozens in her career, epileptic, febrile, drug-induced, and none of them looked quite like this specific wild-eyed hallucinatory panic. She grabbed the emergency kit she'd insisted be kept in every room and found the fast-acting sedative she'd stocked exactly for a moment like this, though she hadn't let herself admit that's what she'd been preparing for. The needle went into his arm with practiced speed, and she counted the seconds until his rigid muscles began, slowly, to unlock. "You're safe," she said, low and steady, the same voice she'd use 100 times on frightened patients coming out of anesthesia. "You're in your penthouse. It's just me. Nothing's touching you. Breathe." His hand found hers and gripped it with a strength that would leave bruises, his eyes finally, slowly, focusing on her face instead of whatever invisible horror had been playing out behind them. "The tea," he rasped, barely audible. "Don't drink the tea," he said. He said it would taste like nothing. "Who? Chihun, who said that?" But his eyes were already glazing again, the sedative pulling him under, his grip on her hand loosening only when he finally lost consciousness. Jin-Hee stayed on the floor beside him for a long time afterward, his hand still loosely in hers, watching his pulse settle into something almost normal on the monitor across the room, turning his fractured words over in her mind. "Don't drink the tea." It sounded like trauma talk, the kind of thing patients said in the fog between consciousness and nightmare that meant nothing and everything at once. Except Jin-Hee had spent 6 years learning to hear the difference between a patient's fear and a patient's memory. She didn't sleep again that night. By the following afternoon, while Chihun was locked in a meeting with Tongyeon that he'd insisted she not attend, curiosity had curdled into something closer to obsession. The penthouse's private medical suite was better equipped than most hospital labs she'd worked in. Full blood work capability, a mass spectrometer she genuinely hadn't expected to find outside a research facility. Everything a man with unlimited money and deep paranoia might install for a physician he intended to keep close and permanently on staff. She drew Chihun's blood herself under the pretense of a routine post-operative panel, and told herself that's all it was. Right up until she was alone in the lab at midnight running every test her training had ever taught her, plus several she'd only read about in journals. Standard blood work came back within normal post-surgical ranges. Liver enzymes elevated but explainable. Nothing that should be causing seizures like the one she'd witnessed. She almost stopped there. It would have been easier to stop there. Instead, some instinct she couldn't fully name, the same instinct that had once caught a misdiagnosed embolism in a patient 3 doctors had cleared for discharge, made her run a broader toxicology screen, the kind hospitals rarely bothered with unless a patient's history specifically demanded it. She set the analysis running and made herself a cup of coffee she didn't finish, pacing the length of the medical suite while the machine hummed through its slow, methodical work. The results appeared on the screen just past 2 a.m., and Jin-Hee read them 3 times before she let herself believe what she was seeing. A compound flagged in trace amounts throughout his bloodstream. Not something standard panels were built to catch. An organic neurotoxin, rare enough that the database took nearly a full minute to cross-reference it against its library, structurally similar to compounds used historically in slow poisonings precisely because they metabolized in a way that mimicked the body's own stress response. Tetrazine. She'd only ever encountered the name once in a toxicology seminar about historical assassination methods. A footnote mentioned in passing as something largely theoretical, difficult to synthesize, nearly impossible to detect without knowing specifically to look for it. Her hands had gone cold. This wasn't psychosomatic trauma. This wasn't a broken man's mind turning against him in the dark. Someone had been feeding Tae Chihun a slow, deliberate poison. Something calibrated precisely to look like panic attacks, like PTSD, like a strong man's private unraveling, so that no one, not his enemies watching for weakness, and not the doctors he'd stopped trusting months ago, would ever think to test for anything else. Jin-Hee sat very still in the humming quiet of the lab, staring at the screen, and understood with a slow, sinking certainty that she had just uncovered something far more dangerous than a single night's transaction. Whoever was doing this to him was patient, careful, close enough to know his daily habits intimately. And they were still out there, still feeding it to him one careful dose at a time. She found him in his study just after dawn, the toxicology report clutched in her hand like evidence in a trial only she understood the stakes of. Chihun looked up from a stack of shipping manifests, and whatever he saw on her face made him set his pen down slowly, deliberately, the way a man braces before a blow he already senses coming. "Someone's poisoning you," Jin-Hee said. No preamble. She decided somewhere in the elevator that gentleness would only waste time he might not have. Not psychologically. Not trauma. A neurotoxin called tetrazine, microdosed, calibrated to mimic panic attacks and organ failure so precisely that nobody would think to test for it. It's in your system right now, accumulating. Whoever's doing this has access to your food or your drink, something consistent, something daily. She watched the words land on him one by one, watched the color drain slowly from beneath his composed expression until what remained was something colder than she'd ever seen on his face. Not fear, not yet, but the terrible stillness of a man doing rapid, silent arithmetic on every person who'd been close enough to hurt him this way. Daily, he repeated quietly, consistent enough to build tolerance and cover the pattern. Something you wouldn't think twice about. She hesitated, then made herself say it. Something ceremonial, maybe something you couldn't refuse without insult. His jaw tightened. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped into a register she hadn't heard from him before. Flat, quiet, the sound of a man watching an entire architecture of trust collapse in real time. Every Sunday for the last 3 years, Peon Young-ji sends a tea set to my private office. Ceremonial blend, brewed by his own household, delivered by his own courier as a mark of respect between him and my father before me. Refusing it would be an insult no boss survives socially. I drink it in front of witnesses. Every week. He looked up at her, and something raw moved behind his eyes. He's the founding elder of this syndicate. He put my father in power 30 years ago. He's the last man I would have suspected. That's exactly why it worked, Jin-Hee said. Nobody watches the hand that built the house. Chihun was quiet for a long moment, staring at the report in her hands like it might rearrange itself into something less true. He doesn't want a war, he finally said. An open challenge would fracture the syndicate, cost him allies, cost him the appearance of honor he spent decades cultivating. But a boss who dies slowly of his own weakness, of trauma from an ambush, of a body that simply gives out under pressure, that's not murder. That's succession. Clean. Deniable. He looked at her, and for the first time since the hospital, she saw something that wasn't calculation in his expression. It was closer to gratitude, raw and unguarded. You just found an execution nobody was supposed to survive discovering. Then stop drinking the tea, Jin-Hee said. If I stop suddenly, he'll know I know. And a man like Young-ji doesn't wait to be caught. He moves the moment his window starts closing. Chihun stood, already reaching for his phone, his mind clearly 3 steps ahead in a strategy she couldn't follow. I need to think. Carefully. Quietly. Tell no one what you found. Not the staff, not Tongyeon, not anyone until I decide how to move. She didn't know, standing there in the pale gray light of that study, that the decision had already been made for both of them, hours before Chihun ever had the chance to act on it. The power went out at 11:47 that night, all at once. The entire penthouse plunged into a darkness so complete that Jeannie's first thought was simple electrical failure. A storm, a grid fault, nothing more. Then the backup generators failed to engage, and the silence that followed had a different quality to it. Heavier, deliberate, the kind of silence that came from someone cutting a system rather than a system breaking on its own. She was in the medical suite when it happened, cross-referencing her toxicology findings against Chihun's older lab work by the glow of her tablet. And in the sudden dark, she froze the way prey freezes, listening. The building's internal radio, a closed-channel system the security team used to coordinate between floors, crackled to life on the emergency battery still humming in the corner, and what came through it stopped her heart cold. Perimeter cameras are down for 6 minutes. That's the window. That's all Young GI's people need. Tongyeon's voice, unmistakable, low and urgent, speaking to someone who wasn't responding on an open channel meant for internal security. The boss is in the East Wing. The nurse is a complication. She found the tea. She's not supposed to be smart enough for that. Jeannie's hand went to her mouth before she could stop it, the tablet nearly slipping from her fingers. Not a rival intercepting a private line. Tongyeon, Chihun's own second-in-command, the man who'd stood between her and the world since the night in room 701, the man Chihun trusted with his life a dozen times a day, coordinating in real time with the very elder trying to kill him. 6 minutes, Tongyeon's voice said again, tighter now, closer to panic than she'd ever heard him. Move now or we lose the window entirely. The radio cut to static. Somewhere below, faint through the darkness and the thick glass, Jin-Hee heard it. The low, coordinated thud of a door being forced, once, twice, the sound traveling up through the building's bones like a heartbeat that didn't belong to it. She didn't scream. She didn't freeze. 6 years of trauma bays had trained the panic out of her hands, even when it stayed lodged white-hot in her chest. She grabbed the emergency medical kit off the counter, shoved every syringe of sedative and every surgical tool she could carry into it, and ran for Chihun's private suite through a darkness lit only by the distant, sourceless glow of the city outside the windows. She found him already collapsing. Chihun was on his knees beside the bed when she burst through the door, one hand braced against the frame, his breathing a horrible, shallow rasp that told her everything before he managed a single word. The sudden absence of the toxin, 3 years of steady dosing cut off in an instant by his own decision that morning to skip the evening second cup, had thrown his body in a violent withdrawal, and beneath the trauma of that his lungs were failing, one of them audibly, catastrophically collapsing under the pressure of everything his body could no longer regulate on its own. Chihun, she was on the floor beside him in an instant, hands already moving, stripping back his shirt to find his chest, rising unevenly, one side barely moving at all, his lips beginning to take on a faint, terrifying blue tinge at the edges. They're coming, he managed, each word costing him visibly. Get out. Get your brother and get out. Not without you. She was already pulling the surgical scissors from her kit, her hand steady even as every instinct screamed at the sound of the outer door splintering somewhere down the hall. Closer now, seconds away instead of minutes. She found the space between his ribs by feel and memory. 6 years of trauma, training collapsing into pure muscle memory. This is going to hurt. I need you to hold as still as you possibly can. She didn't wait for him to agree. The blade went in fast and precise, and Chihun's whole body seized against a scream he swallowed through sheer will, and then air rushed back into his collapsed lung in a horrible, beautiful wheeze that meant he was breathing, meant he wasn't dying on the floor of his own bedroom while his own lieutenant sold him out one level below. The outer door of the suite gave way with a crack of splintering wood. Jin-Hee didn't think. She grabbed the second syringe from her kit, a paralytic agent at 10 times standard dosage, meant for surgical emergencies, meant for exactly nothing like this, and positioned herself in the shadow beside the doorframe as the first hitman came through low and fast, rifle sweeping the dark room for a target he expected to find weak and unarmed. He found her instead. She drove the needle into the side of his neck with every ounce of strength 6 years of restraining combative patience had taught her, and the man's rifle clattered to the floor as his own muscles betrayed him mid-stride, his body folding sideways into the wall in a silence that felt, to Jin-Hee, louder than any gunshot could have been. Behind her, she heard Chihun rise. What followed happened in the strange, compressed time of true violence. Seconds stretching and collapsing, sound arriving in fragments. Chihun scooped the fallen hitman's rifle off the floor with the fluid, terrible ease of a man who had done this before, long before he ever became a boss who mostly delegated it to others, and moved into the hallway with a speed his ruined lungs shouldn't have allowed. Jin-Hee heard controlled bursts of gunfire, heard the low shouts of Chihun's remaining loyal security finally converging from the West Wing, where they'd been cut off by the power failure, heard glass breaking somewhere below as someone went through a window rather than face what was coming for them. She stayed with Mingyu, who she dragged into the medical suite's reinforced closet the moment the shooting started, her body between him and the door, her hand pressed hard over his mouth not to silence him, but to remind them both to breathe quietly, to be small, to survive the next 4 minutes, so there could be a fifth. When it finally went quiet, the silence felt like its own kind of violence, ringing and total. She found Chihun in the main lobby 20 minutes later, blood on his shirt that wasn't entirely his own, Tongyeon on his knees in front of him with 2 of Chihun's loyal men holding either arm. Tongyeon's carefully constructed composure had finally, completely cracked, sweat and something closer to disbelief streaking down a face that had never once, in Jin-Hee's presence, looked anything less than perfectly controlled. 3 years, Chihun said, his voice quiet in a way that was somehow worse than shouting. 3 years I trusted you with every door in this building. You were going to fall eventually, Tongyeon said, and there was no apology in it, only the exhausted honesty of a man who no longer had anything left to protect. Yongji promised a clean transition. No war. No bloodshed. I thought I was saving the syndicate from tearing itself apart. His eyes found Jin-Hee's across the wrecked lobby, and something in his expression finally, fully broke. Not fear the gun Chihun was already raising, but something closer to disbelief that a debt-drowning hospital nurse he'd personally driven to this penthouse, a woman he dismissed as a convenient, disposable liability from the very first night, had somehow unraveled a plan 3 years in the careful making. You were supposed to be the scapegoat, he said to her, almost wondering. When his organs finally failed for good, you were supposed to be the nurse who missed it. Nobody was supposed to look past you. I don't miss things, Jin-Hee said. Chihun didn't say anything else. The sound that followed was final, and Jin-Hee turned away from it, not out of squeamishness, but because some part of her, the part that had spent her whole career fighting to keep people alive, didn't need to watch the moment that particular philosophy ran out of road. When she turned back, it was over, and Chihun was looking at her across the ruined lobby with an expression she'd never seen on him before, something unguarded and enormous that he didn't try to hide. Peon Yongji disappeared before dawn, fleeing the city with what remained of his loyalists once word reached him that his coup had failed and his mole was dead, and though Chihun's men would spend weeks hunting the threads of that network to their roots, the war he'd feared, open, bloody, syndicate fracturing, never came. A boss who survived an assassination attempt this cleanly, this completely, didn't invite challengers. He silenced them by simply, undeniably, still being alive. 3 days later, in the quiet, sun-washed calm of the penthouse's private study, Chihun slid a folder across the polished table toward her. Outside the windows, Seoul spread out gold and glittering under a sky finally, fully clear of storm clouds, the city that had nearly buried them both now simply beautiful, indifferent, waiting. Your employment contract, he said, and when she reached for it, expecting the same transactional coldness of that first morning in room 701, he reached out and tore it cleanly in half instead, setting the pieces aside with something almost like ceremony. That's not what I'm offering you. He slid a second document across the table. Jin-Hee scanned it once, then again, understanding slower than the words themselves. Not a contract of employment, but a partnership deed, permanent, her name written into the architecture of the Golden Dragon Syndicate's medical and security operations, not as staff, not as leverage, but as something the entire organization would answer to. I don't need a nurse anymore, Tae Chihun said quietly. I need someone who can see what everyone else misses. Someone the syndicate answers to when it comes to what keeps all of us alive. I'm not offering you a job. I'm offering you a seat at the table you already earned the hard way. Jin-Hee looked at the deed for a long moment, thinking of the girl who'd stood trembling in room 7014 days ago, clutching a metal clipboard like armor. Thinking of Mingyu asleep down the hall in a room that no longer needed to fear a stairwell full of debt collectors. Thinking of every desperate calculation that had brought her to this exact chair in this exact light. She picked up the pen and signed her name. I'm not doing this because I'm afraid of you anymore, she said, sliding the deed back across the table. I know, Chihun said, and for the first time since the night she'd met him, he smiled like he meant it completely. That's exactly why I'm doing this. Outside, Seoul went on glittering beneath them, indifferent to the empire that had nearly fallen and the woman who'd rebuilt it with nothing but steady hands and a refusal to look away. And in Jin-Hee, once a debt-drowning nurse with nothing left to lose, sat in the quiet gold light of the penthouse she now called home, and understood, without a single trace of the fear that had once ruled her life, that she was never leaving his side again.